Welcome to The Real Story. I'm your host, Riley Lewis. Thank you for joining us. Never think that war, no matter how necessary, nor how justified, is not a crime. These words, attributed to American novelist Ernest Hemingway, are truly timeless, because they speak to the grave consequences of any war, from the loss of precious human life to the physical destruction of entire countries. And they're based on Hemingway's own experiences in World War I and World War II. Now, to be clear, he didn't serve as a soldier in either conflict. However, he did serve in both conflicts in some other ways. So during World War I, he volunteered for the American Red Cross with an ambulance unit in Italy, where he was wounded by Austrian mortar fire in July of 1918. He was deemed unfit to serve as a soldier himself, and ended up volunteering in some other critical ways, where he was eventually rendered unconscious by that mortar shell that fell just feet away from him. In fact, hundreds of shards of metal pierced his flesh, and he was sent to the hospital to recover. However, despite that, he later returned to Europe to cover the Second World War as a war correspondent, and received a Bronze Star for his efforts at a small ceremony in June of 1947 because his brave actions, designed to capture an accurate picture of conditions on the ground, were deemed meritorious. So those direct experiences also shaped his perspective of war itself. He witnessed war's destructive nature and saw the physical toll and the emotional toll that it took on the soldiers who fought in them, leading him to conclude that war is brutal, not glorious, and that it creates more problems than it solves. And to his credit, one doesn't have to look very far to see the truth in his point, with the war between Russia and Ukraine being a prime example. So speaking of, the war is now in its fourth year, and it remains the deadliest military conflict to erupt in Europe since World War II. Entire communities have been reduced to ruins. Families have been torn apart, and the war itself has taken a major toll on both countries. Both sides have seen military casualties and widespread civilian deaths, and some reports have claimed that the war has created Europe's largest refugee crisis in decades. And for what, exactly? What is it that the fighting is doing for either side? That's the most important question at the center of this whole conflict. In any case, that does bring us to some latest updates about what's going on the ground. Now, as it stands, Russian forces control about 20% of Ukrainian territory still, primarily in the east and south, and many of the towns in these regions have been badly damaged. Russian advances have been slow and costly, and they've also been met with significant resistance from Ukraine, which has been bolstered by aid from Western countries like the US. But both countries still continue to attack one another, escalating the war through drone and missile strikes, and there doesn't seem to be an end in sight, at least not as of right now. Case in point, a Ukrainian drone attack over the weekend damaged a power line and caused a fire at a railway station in the Volgograd region of Russia, according to Russian state officials. No damage was done to the railway itself, but local officials governing the area said the attack was massive. But Russian forces have also recently struck Ukraine, and Russia's campaign has targeted civilian infrastructure in cities such as Kyiv, reportedly forcing millions of Ukrainians into bomb shelters and metro stations on a near nightly basis. On that note, things have been so severe that Russian forces have reportedly launched 6,400 drones and missiles into Ukraine in July of this year alone, marking the deadliest month of aerial assault seen since the war began. Although that's only according to Ukrainian officials, and the numbers exactly are disputed. But as tensions continue to escalate day by day, the pathway to peace seems to be increasingly more difficult to navigate. And whether or not peace between Putin and Zelensky or even remains possible is an open question. However, that is where President Trump enters the picture. Trump has spent months and months trying to achieve peace between them, but to no avail. He's spoken to Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky about peace multiple times, and pushed publicly for more peace talks between them, even giving Putin a deadline to make progress toward that goal by this Friday, or face a new round of sanctions. But despite this mounting pressure, those talks between them have stalled. So now, in a bold effort to move things in the right direction, Trump is taking a new measure. That brings us to Friday, when he announced that he's ordered 2 nuclear submarines to be repositioned to strategic locations. That comes on a post on Truth Social. Now, it seems those vessels have been moved, according to his statements he made today, but here's what he said in the post. Based on the highly provocative statements of former President of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, who is now the deputy chairman of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, I have ordered 2 nuclear submarines to be positioned in the appropriate regions, just in case these foolish and inflammatory statements are more than just that. Words are very important and can often lead to unintended consequences. I hope this will not be one of those instances. Thank you for your attention to this matter. What happens from here still remains unclear, but the nature of these recent escalations raises some very important questions. For example, what is Russia really fighting for here? Similarly, what is Ukraine really fighting for? And most importantly to me, why are Western powers such as the US involved in this war? Is this really an attempt to hold Moscow accountable for launching some unprovoked war of aggression in Eastern Europe? Or is this really about expanding Western influence and turning Russia into a puppet state of the West, in the same way that Ukraine was turned into a puppet state of the West? Only time will tell, but one thing is perfectly clear. This war, like almost every other war in history, is creating a whole lot more problems than it's solving. Now, here with his analysis and reaction is Davis Younts, a military defense attorney for Younts Law. Davis, thank you for being here.
Always an honor, Riley.
So I have a lot of questions for you, but at this point in the war, I want to start with this one. What do you think it is that Russia is really fighting for here?
You know, I think we have 2 things that are happening within Russia that we need to be aware of, because I think it's going to impact how Russia approaches negotiations moving forward. Okay. I think we have the strategic interests of Russia as a whole, and then I think we have the political interests of Vladimir Putin. The more this drags on, the more of a toll it takes on Russia. There is an element here where we have to begin to wonder, what control does Putin have, and what are the political consequences for him? Certainly, he's ruled as a dictator. He's ruled with an iron fist, had tight control of elections and other things, and he is and still remains an old school, communist Soviet operative. That's who he is. That's how he grew up. So we can't forget those things. So I think there's 2 pieces of this. I think there are the strategic goals of Russia as a whole, but I also think there's what is in the political interests of Vladimir Putin, and what things are going to put him in a position where eventually the powers that be in Russia may look to push him out as the toll gets too high or this drags on. So I think we have to keep both of those things in mind as we move forward. And in reality, Riley, I think the same applies to Vladimir Zelensky. At some point, it is entirely possible that Zelensky will lose the support of his own people if this continues to drag on and there is no resolution.
I want to ask you for a question. This calls for some speculation, but I think it's really important for a lot of Americans, myself included. Where do you think we would be right now, in August of 2025, had the U.S. not intervened to support Ukraine?
You know, I spend a lot of time thinking about that. It doesn't help us necessarily today, but it does help us in the future when we think about strategic analysis and strategic policy for the United States. So the Trump administration is working extremely hard to just at least get to a ceasefire at this point so that some things can be done to stop the human suffering that's happened. But the reality is we intervened in a fight that we really didn't have to intervene in at the time, and we don't know now how long it's going to take to resolve it. Again, we propped up Ukraine with money and with arms with no accountability for it, no strategic plan, no goal of ending this, and everything we did looked like aggression and NATO expansion to Russia. So I don't think it is unduly harsh to say the Biden administration completely fumbled this, both from lack of clear messaging as well as a lack of a strategic end goal, and you didn't have a strong leader in the White House House to set the tone and say that, listen, we're about protecting U.S. interests. That's not what was done. And so we are in a mess. And again, one of the problems now is, how do we stop it? How do we end this? And we have to understand it now strategically from Russia's perspective as well as Ukraine's perspective, because they have lost so much. It becomes very, very difficult for these leaders and really these people to end the war well at this point in time. So that's where we're in this unfortunate mess where innocent people continue to die because this seems to be an unending war at this point.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people are very nervous about the idea of another prolonged, protracted military conflict somewhere around the world, far, far away from the American people, that's being funded by U.S. tax dollars in large part. And that brings us to a very important question, Davis. I've been thinking about this basically every single day since February of 2022, when this whole thing began and Putin invaded Ukraine. What is the pathway to peace? How do we finally get them both to the negotiating table and stop the bloodshed and the destruction? How do we do that, Davis?
As I said, it's extremely difficult at this point. We have to understand and look for a scenario that allows both of these leaders and both of these countries to continue to exist and continue to have some level of control. But again, I think the problem that we're running into now is both of these nations, every day that goes by, have expended so much wealth.
Yes.
They've expended so much life that it becomes, these become decades-long grudges, centuries-long grudges that continue to cause problems into the future. So we need to be looking at solutions that could potentially bring long-term peace. I think there are pathways there. I don't think it is unreasonable to look at the boundaries from 2014 and possibly some other concessions of Ukrainian territory for Russia. But we have to have a ceasefire. We have to have an opportunity for these sides to come together and negotiate. So we're looking right now, we have to look to August 8th. That's the deadline that Trump set, asking for a ceasefire. So I think we're going to see a continued escalation up to that date. And then the question is, what happens when we hit that date? Will either side be willing to come forward and make the first step of trying to stop this conflict?
Yes, completely. Of course, that deadline being this Friday, actually. And he made that announcement last Friday, I believe, about the deadline for Putin. But that's also the exact same day he announced the news of authorizing the movement of 2 nuclear-armed submarines to strategic locations. What do you make of that, and how do you think that move might change things on the ground for Putin?
It'll be interesting to see if that has a clear impact. What it does is it does show Trump's commitment to peace through strength. It is a clear reminder that at any given time, the United States Navy has 8 to 10 of our 14 Ohio-class submarines with the large capacity to essentially destroy Russia as we know it at any given time, deployed throughout the world. So he's not telling exactly where they're going. He's not really telling the Russians anything they don't know and understand. We have those submarines placed strategically as a deterrent to protect our homeland. So by reminding them that we have the ability to reach out and do this, it does tone down the rhetoric from political hardliners like the former Russian president, who doesn't have a huge role in the Russian government now, but he is sort of an ally of Putin who has had control in the past. And we see him using very dangerous sort of Cold War rhetoric, and Trump just put a quick stop to that. So I do think that's part of Trump's overall messaging to Russia and to the rest of the world, that he is not only willing to demonstrate the deterrence capability of the United States military, but also to use other means to try to achieve peace here, whether it's negotiations or through trade deals or other things.
I believe the strategy is called escalate to de-escalate. And to your point, Davis, I think it's going to work. We'll have to see. We'll have to look ahead to what happens on Friday, August 8th, this week. But I'm really hoping and praying for less destruction and bloodshed. And I want us to put an end to this war. And I'm glad that President Trump is spearheading the movement for peace in this battle, because it's deadly, it's nasty. And I don't think it's doing anything for either side in terms of addressing some of those centuries-old political disputes about borders, territory, and spheres of influence on the world stage. So we'll just have to see what happens. But Davis, thank you for being here today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
It's left to men like Davis Younts to fight for these Navy SEALs. Davis Younts, you are an attorney who has successfully defended naval officers.
Davis Younts has been instrumental in defending the servicemen.
Davis Younts
successfully defended an evangelical Navy lieutenant